Welcome to the Databricks Skill Builder series. We're glad you're here.
Good afternoon for people on different time zones. So my name is Alexander Gauthier. I'm a specialist solutions architect, and I focus mainly on data engineering, but also I work a lot with developers as well. So what we wanted to look into today is Databricks has recently released an extension for VS Code, which in a nutshell allows you to execute different either notebooks or Python code or SQL code directly from VS Code. Also allows you to debug your code that's currently running as well. So the objectives today, I want to make sure, explain the main feature of VS Code, what it can provide from a development perspective, understand the local and workspace requirement to get the extension to work. Also to install and configure local Python environment, Python files, and then how to run either as a pure Python piece of code file or as a notebook using a standard workflow job on Databricks. And then also, we'll, if time permits, we'll look a little bit into how we can actually run unit tests with custom runtime configuration, be able from VS Code to control the CI/CD process that we have in place. So if you're not familiar with VS Code, it's an IDE for developing source code. It provides support for various languages from C++ to Java to Python as well, of course. So I'm sure if you're not familiar, it's kind of like IntelliJ or back in the day Visual Studio, pure Visual Studio. So what the extension allows you to do is to connect directly to Databricks. So instead of having to go directly in the workspace and write a set of notebooks or having either a Python wheel or a jar file that you want to run and have to schedule in Databricks, you can actually do it directly in the IDE and be able to debug the code as well, which is very interesting. So what it does is essentially it'll connect directly to Databricks, to a Databricks cluster. So that gives you the ability to locally debug without having to configure all the Spark context. To connect to a remote instance, I have to put in place a bunch of hooks for getting the debugger to bring back the information. Everything runs on a cluster, so you can have a cluster for development, and you can even run on a production cluster if you're trying to do some test cluster if you're trying to do CI/CD and move into production. All right, so feature-wise, so the goal really is to provide that native experience. If you're a developer, you don't want to have to learn a bunch of different environments. You want to stick to what you know as much as possible and focus on the actual business problem or technical problem. So that's what we're really pushing here, is to run into an environment that the developers are really familiarized with and very comfortable. Configuring wise, it's actually pretty simple to configure. In the past, we had other client tools that were a little bit more difficult to configure. But the setup is very simple, and the beauty of it too is you can have different profiles. So we'll look into it in more details, but allows you to be able to connect to multiple workspaces. If you want to switch between different projects, you can actually do it. There's Git integration as well, so you can actually set up your project and it'll auto sync what's on the cluster. If you have a Git repository that is already on the workspace, it will actually sync up that as well, which is very interesting. So it gives you that ability to use full source control, both in the IDE and also in the workspace itself. And then internal local unit testing. I'm not sure we're going to have time to dig deep into this, but the extension all has capability to attach to external unit test system like a Jenkins or something like that, and be able to connect directly into the IDE and be able to run code directly from the IDE, instead of having to run using just job APIs. All right, so prerequisite, you must at least have one repository in place within Databricks. So the Databricks repo feature, so there's workspace and there's also the repo feature. So you need to have a repository already in place, at least one, or be able to create one as well. You must have repo and files in repo available as well. The reason files in repo is because we do save the VS Code configuration of the project within that repo. So look at it like the little stub for the project that's running on VS Code. And you must, of course, have at least one cluster. We'll recommend personal compute, but it's just, if you're looking at it more like from a developer's perspective, but any cluster available can be used within the IDE. We don't support SQL warehouses yet. So SQL warehouse is specific type of clusters, or we call them also endpoints. They're actually a set of clusters under an endpoint, and they're geared toward more executing SQL BI type of queries, or something that's very interactive and pure SQL. So it basically mainly connect through JDBC. So that's why we can't really connect to those type of clusters yet. But you can still run SQL. It's not a problem. You still can run on the other type of clusters. All right, so there's some requirements of VS Code. I think it's pretty simplistic. If it's not in place, you probably can upgrade on the fly. You do have a configuration file that gives you the connectivity and the credential information to connect to that cluster. You must use a personal access token. Well, that one I'm not entirely sure, but I do believe you do need a personal access token. If not, if the cluster has regular authentication, no, I don't think it's sufficient because it's using the API. So never mind, you do need a personal access token. And then also for code completion, IntelliSense must be in place. So that gives you the ability to, if you're navigating through Databricks libraries or Python libraries, they'll give you the autocomplete, which is actually pretty interesting, including utilities, Databricks utilities as well. So you get the Databricks part into code completion. All right, so next, I'm going to walk you through the installation, what it actually requires to get all set up. So we're going to jump into VS Code here. All right, so to get started, you can go. I already have it installed, so it's a little bit different, but we're going to go into how we actually get started. So we can go into configuring the extensions. So if you look here, we have extensions. There's an entire marketplace. So if we go into Databricks, so you'll see different components. So in that case, we're interested into the one that's actually created by Databricks. So that will be this one here, first one. This I'm not sure. It looks like a third party, and then this one is more for if you want to connect into like SQL tools type of environment. This one is specific to DBT for power user working with Databricks. So we'll select this one. In that case, it's already installed for me. And the next step will be to configure the connectivity. So we'll go back to the main page here. So once you install the extension, if you click on it to activate it, you'll get this this page for documentation, I guess. All right, so I configured extension. So as I'm already configured here, but the way it would normally work, I would actually get here into configuration, and then I would go and select a cluster. Once I select my cluster, now I'll select what we call a profile. So most likely in this case, you won't have a profile in place. So let's select the workspace host and the cluster, sorry. And then here, let's look at what the profile looks like. So you'll auto-generate this. It'll ask you for the host is already entered, and then it'll actually break you into this. This will be generated. The only thing you need to add is that token API. If you're not familiar how to get a token, so let's go into a regular workspace here. So if you go under user here and you do user settings, there'll be a portion called access token, and you'll be able to generate a token. Once you generate the token, make sure to copy it because it's no longer visible after that. Oh, I see there's a question here. Okay, feel free to ask questions. Perfect. So once you get that token, let's go back to our you enter the token here, and you should be good to go. So the second thing to do in terms of be able to run code, there'll be some modules to install. So it really depends on your environment. So you might have to, here you'll see the terminal. So I don't know if I don't have the whole history here, but there might be some module you need to install. So you'll get a prompt here. So okay, you need module XYZ, and then from there you'll be able to install directly from there. So I think, for example, pip might need to be updated a little bit. All right, I hope I'm not going too fast. Do you guys have any questions so far? It's relatively straightforward. So in terms of runtime, there's multiple modes to run the code. I could run just pure Python like this. And then if you go here into execution, you'll be able to run either as just a regular Python file on Databricks, or what we call run file as a workflow on Databricks. So workflow, the difference here is that it's going to run as a notebook instead of just pure Python code. So let's say, for example, if I look into my current project here, not this one, oops, there you go. So I do have here a set of, they look like Python files, but if you really open the code, it's actually a Python, a Databricks notebook in Python. So if I want to run this way, I'll have to go and run it as a workflow. So it's just one, it's not really a limitation, it's just the way they encapsulate and run on the target cluster. So two modes of execution, either as pure Python, or if you have existing notebooks, like in this case, this repo is my repo that I use on the workspace as well. So these are actually notebooks that have been edited. So if we go back to Databricks, so there's two configurations we'll need to do here before we can execute. The first one will be we'll have to select a cluster. So I should have done it from the start. I just want to make sure we didn't run into issue like installing on the fly. So I wanted to pre-install it, but the first thing you will get once you set up the actual connectivity workspace information, and it will actually connect and it will populate these clusters here. So you'll see everything that's available on a given cluster. So based on your permission, again, you're going to be logged in as with your personal access token. It'll use your credentials. So any type of restriction in terms of cluster usage will obviously apply here. When you select a cluster, it will actually be indicated here. Here you can see what's currently running. I believe you can actually start items. If you have permissions, I think if you connect, it'll actually start it. And then the second thing here, I'm not sure what it's showing in there. We have to set up a sync destination. So that's, remember I mentioned we need at least one repo. That's what I was referring to here. So if you go and click here, configure. So we'll actually either create one if you don't have one already, or you can use an existing one as well. So here's a little bit of confusion. I didn't specify the name correctly, so it actually went directly in the root of my account. So I think that's a problem here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my workspace and actually delete that troublesome repository. Okay, cool. So we should be good to go here. So let's go back here. It says I deleted, looks like the same destination is still attached. Okay. All right. Doesn't match. Okay. Sorry about that. Not sure what's going on here. So let's select an existing one. Okay. Let me try to put the actual info pad here. Don't click away. Apparently, don't click away. Okay. Might just be a permission level at the repo level. That's what I'm suspecting. So let's go back to just using the actual root of my repository location on the workspace. All right, let's refresh here. Okay, it still doesn't like it. Okay. Okay, I think we still can run without it. I think it's really just for the when we want to run as a notebook. So let's go here. One thing as well, if we don't have all the libraries in place, we go back here, there's something that needs to be done in terms of adding configuration. So if you don't have this already, or you want to put a second library, you can actually go back in and add a second set of library using the configuration. Otherwise, it's just going to use the regular Databricks libraries. All right, let's try to execute this one. See where we are here. Oh, little thing here. Let's cancel this because when I click on that cluster, I reassign to that cluster. My bad. All right, so we're going to go back to our regular shared auto scaling, America shared cluster. Okay, so we're still getting the error. Sorry about that, guys. Still getting the error with the sync configuration. I'm not sure exactly what needed to be added here, unfortunately, but normally if we had the execution going on correctly, I would get the results. I could also I can actually add breakpoints as well. So I'll actually follow the execution there as well. So this is not very complex, but if I had like a larger file here, I could actually put breakpoints in place. And as we go through the execution, we'll actually stop there and you can actually look into execution variables. If I'm watching variables, I can add some watches in here. So in that case, probably wasn't compiled, so probably can't see it per se, but if let's say I wanted to add a watch, like a regular debugging, let's see here if it actually writes the, let's see, context. So I could actually do to browse the actual Spark session variable, for example. So go back to source control integration. So there's two things here. Project. Hold on. So I can actually go back and source control directly here as well. So like, for example, if I modify, this is a new file, this is added, I can actually, this is actually modified. I can actually go back and check back in the code directly from the IDE, obviously, and then go back to the workspace. And if we're having the same repository, it'll actually sync up to the repo as well. What else? Oh, there's also a set of extension commands. So if we go into commands here, I remember the here. There you go. So these are a command that we can execute directly without. We can actually bind them to just like toolboxes and stuff like that. So essentially the way it works with VS Code is each extension or each component will have a set of command available. So we can actually go directly to this command or use the console as well. So if you wanted to, for example, to do some sort of automation where I want to be able to create a new cluster, for example, or configure a cluster before I do a certain type of execution, you can actually use these different commands to do that. It provides you pretty much all the basic it does. I don't see create cluster here, but I've seen it in the documentation somewhere else. I'm not sure why it's on there. It might be because of my credentials on the cluster, but I could do that. Just go create a cluster and run some tests. For example, if I have unit tests I want to run from here. So that's the last part I want to get into is like internal automation. This is like any regular Python project. So if I wanted to create a set of unit tests or integrated tests that want to run directly from VS Code or Azure DevOps, for example, in the case of Microsoft Azure environment, that's something that can be done as well. So it will actually use the extension to connect to the cluster and run all the execution. So essentially what it gives you is the ability to do CI/CD automation without having to set up all the connectivity and the automation outside in a separate tool that will require such connectivity. So once you set up your configurations, you have connectivity and you can run from there. So you could use a service principal, for example, as the authenticator in the extension and run from directly from the extension. All right, I apologize about this. All right, I don't want to spend 10 minutes chasing this. But what I'm suspecting here is that there's probably some sync issues where I don't have the permission to create a repository on the cluster I'm actually using. So that will be the error. But once this is set up, what it does essentially, it's pretty straightforward. You'll see an IDE file essentially that's kind of like the stub that we put on the repo on the workspace side to understand the configuration where the extension is coming from. And then what it does is just basically sync up all the metadata and the attributes on the cluster itself. I mean, on the workspace itself. So that's really all it's trying to do here. So if we actually dug in there, you see there's all our permission related stuff. So that's what I'm guessing here. I probably don't have the right role to do so, unfortunately, in that cluster. Because I tested yesterday on Azure because I really wanted to try both main cloud vendors to see if there's any differences in terms of behavior. There isn't, but I went back to this is a cluster on AWS, so that's I probably just don't have the permission here, so I apologize for that. But there's also a couple of videos online that walk you through like more advanced features as well. If you wanted to do things that are more complex, like in terms like having a big project with a lot of dependencies and having to sync up code and deploy custom libraries, that's another thing that can be done with the different commands and the extensions. What if I have a special, Python package that needs to be installed in the cluster before I can actually run, execute that? That's all available as well. That can be scripted or that can be done from the UI as well. And last note, this is still what we call public preview. So what it means is that it is ready for production, but it's not fully GCA yet. It's production ready, but it's not officially GCA, I should say. So we do still support it actively. That's not a problem. It's free, of course. You can go directly into the marketplace, download it. From a support perspective, if you have any questions, we'll send some links afterward, but the best way to do it is through the Git project that is on Databricks Labs. It's monitored quite closely, so if there's any issues, they'll note it from the GitHub, and then they'll probably put it into a future release if there's a fix needed, or I think there's also some feature requests that are possible to provide as well on there. So that is it on my side. I don't see any questions here. Is there any questions?
Yeah, there were a couple of questions that were asked during this session. So if anyone has other questions, feel free to send it by Q&A.
Yes, a question about
that came through in chat.
Can we use a cluster simultaneously? So yeah, if it's interactive cluster, yeah, you could have many users that are interacting and using the cluster. Any cluster? Oh, okay. So thanks, she already answered. Okay, yeah. So there's no restriction as long as the cluster type here. So let's see. So yeah, so any cluster that you have permission to, interactive, of course, you'll be able to connect directly. They recommend at first using we'll call like personal cluster, access mode, share, sign, single cluster, single user, but it really doesn't matter as long as long as it's an interactive cluster, that shouldn't be a problem. One thing I've noticed as well is in some cases, depending on how the cluster is or the workspace is configured under your vendor, make sure to talk to IT if you have any problem with connectivity. I don't think that there should be any, but I've seen some cases where, for some reason internally, some users aren't able to access the Databricks API because that's underneath. That's essentially what the plugin extension uses. So I've seen some cases. It might be because it's turned off as well. So remember, I generate that token in here, probably not admin on this cluster, unfortunately. But sometimes the access to the API is not available. So in that case, you would have to go to your workspace admin, and within the admin console, you should be able to, oh, maybe I have access after all. I do. All right, so there is some configuration that are at the workspace level will allow generating tokens. If it's not enabled, you need to do that. And also making sure that, let's see, file store, verbose, we don't need that. There's another one about API access. So this, oh, okay, there you go. So Git repo must be available without any restrictions. So that's either that or set up an what we'll call allow list. So there's like very specific repos that we need for development, and will be added here. But then I'm not sure if it's going to cause a problem I had before with the sync folder. Probably not. Take a look.
There's one more question, Alexander, from
Sure.
Thomas. Is there a way to run a cell rather than running a file on the cluster?
Run a cell. Is there a way to run a cell? Oh, I see. Thomas, you're probably referring to when I look into a notebook and I can just run like one command. And that's a good question. I don't think there is. Unfortunately, execute as a full Python file. But that would be nice, right? So you can just highlight, select just part of the code and run that. I don't think it's supported yet, unfortunately.
I think the idea is that VS Code is going to be, we're trying to support people who don't want to code in the notebook experience. So if you want the notebook experience, it's just easier to log into Databricks itself. That's my understanding, but I could be wrong. There may be a point in time when we expand the capabilities, but I think that's kind of where we are at this point.
That's correct. And also feature-wise, looking at the roadmap, there's been a lot of requests to support SQL as well. So that might be coming in the pipeline as well. So the reason why it's been kind of put aside as lower priority is that often customers who want to just do SQL, they'll just use the JDBC driver and use some SQL ID that they already have, which I think you can do with VS Code as well. Then they connect directly to the SQL endpoint and then run pure SQL. This is really more geared toward developers, essentially. Because yeah, when you start writing larger projects with a lot of code, yeah, there's like a diminishing return with notebooks, because you do need to navigate through all the cells and need to organize notebooks. If you have dependencies and everything, there's ways to do it that are it's slightly convenient. It's just when you get into the hundreds number of files, that's where it starts getting a little harder to manage with just notebooks. So that's when coded project structure and an ID is a little bit easier to manage. So that was the idea behind it. Question I got a lot too is, I'm not sure if we're targeting to support other IDs. IntelliJ comes up quite a bit, PyCharm as well. I'm not sure. We did in the past. So we had a previous rev of this, which was not quite as easy to use. It required a lot of configuration. It was different from one ID to the other. The idea was to really make it simpler and really take advantage of what the ID has to provide as well. The other one is a little bit more generic. And if I remember correctly, only supported Python, if I'm not mistaken. Python and Scala. Now, good question. Do we support Scala? I don't think we do with this one, unfortunately. But let's be honest, Scala is not as popular as it used to be. Probably out of customer maybe have 5% of that still use Scala. All right, I hope this was helpful. We had 30 minutes originally, so I kind of planned for 30 minutes. I see that we'll book for an hour. If there's any other question or things we want to cover, I'd be happy to. Otherwise, I think we're good here. We'll send some links afterwards. We do have a couple of videos, public videos available. They'll give you more insight into the deeper features. And also the GitHub repository, a GitHub project is available as well. And again, just to reiterate, any problems you face, that's probably the best place to do that. Either that or go on community, Databricks community. I think there's already a few threads about this, but it's probably going to be faster to go and post on the GitHub project.
There's in fact one more question coming in, Alexander. So the question from Thomas again is that, can you describe the steps to migrate a current notebook-based project to VS Code?
That's a good question. So notebook, here's the thing, Thomas, if you're already using the repo feature within Databricks, you can just reuse the, so I'll give you an example here. So if you guys remember, like that's more like the traditional way to structure workspace. So a set of users might have shared folder, and then we have a set of notebooks in place. The reason why we wanted to move away from that and came up with a repo feature is that you're kind of stuck. If you want to move that around, you have to export everything. It's a pain in the butt, right? So if you're already in the repo, like in that case here, I have my repo Databricks workspace, that can be used directly. That's actually what I've done here. All I did was connected to my repo and Databricks workspace, and everything is there. So you'll see your notebooks, they'll show up as Python, PYs. So essentially there's no migration per se. You could just connect directly. If not, what I would recommend is if you're still using the old workspace structure, I would export everything into a DBC archive and then create a repo and kind of migrate to the repo features essentially. And then from there, you just click add your repo and you can run this directly. But I didn't have that whole problem I got. I could run this directly. So these are all commented out. They're just magic commands, and then it'll actually execute the code in sequential manner. I think
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm gonna say, I think you have my contact information. As Stephanie mentioned, just don't hesitate. If you want to reach out directly to me, that's totally fine. Alexander Gauthier at Databricks.com. Be happy to help. We're intensively looking for feedback, so happy to hear your side.
Well, awesome. Thanks so much for your time today, Alex and Chia, for answering questions. And appreciate you all joining today. I hope this was helpful.
Right. Good afternoon,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.